Deep in the glowing sea is a ruined building called Atlantic Offices. This ruined corporate structure contains a secret that many people might not know about. When you arrive at the Atlantic Offices, we see that it has a beautiful Art Deco sign. This gave me hope that this building would be deep and interesting, with lots of encounters. After all, Bethesda went to all the trouble to design this pretty little sign and to name the location instead of simply calling it Ruined Skyscraper. Just outside the offices, we often find a Deathclaw. This structure must have been near to a road. We find two blasted out buses, and the ground is littered with skeletons. This is quite a gruesome scene. How many dead bodies do we find here? 10? 12? 15? Near to these buses is a buried bus stop. So it's likely that these buses had stopped at the bus stop to pick up people when the bombs dropped. In my video on the relay tower that we find here, we discussed the idea that perhaps liquefaction played a role in creating the new landscape we find at the glowing sea. This idea is that the Earth lost so much of its structure due to the nuclear bombs that it acted almost like a liquid. This is why we find so many sunken structures. I also think that it caused pyroclastic flows, rivers of hot, molten mud rock, possibly lava, and I think that this area holds up that idea. The skeletons we find aren't just laying on top, they are embedded in the mud. This section of Earth also looks like it had been liquid at one point, and over the years it dried and cracked like a dry seabed. We can enter the Atlantic Offices by climbing through a broken wall on the northern side of the building. Inside, we find our first feral ghoul and even more climb up the stairs.
Threat eliminated.
It's likely that the Atlantic Offices sunk like many of the other tall, heavy structures here in the glowing sea. This is possibly the third or fourth floor. Near to the elevator is a door that leads us to a narrow office room. It seems really narrow to be an office, but here we find a couple of desks. Looking up, we find a hole in the roof. Using our jetpack to leap up, we find a terminal lying on the desk. I had hoped for some rich and interesting lore, but sadly this terminal only unlocks a security gate at the opposite side of this little room. The contents of this gate are equally disappointing. We find some computer terminals, monitoring devices, and then just a toolbox and a desk. But now we are on the floor above. Heading out the door to this room, we find ghouls sleeping on the ground.
Please don't. Why do they even try?
Heading through the room directly across from us, we find a bunch of blasted out cabinets and a hole in the floor that looks down onto the stairway that we found upon first entering. Heading out and around the hallway, we can exit the building through a hole in the wall onto the terrace. This terrace is directly beneath the Atlantic Offices sign. We can climb off of the terrace onto the land to walk around the building. Using our jetpack, we can jump up on top of the roof. Here we find a fusion generator and a fusion core inside. The roof is collapsed into the top floor of this structure. Heading down the ramp, we can kill even more sleeping ghouls. In this room, there's an advanced locked safe in the corner. Going underneath the collapsed ceiling, we find two restrooms. The men's is empty, and the women's is locked with a novice lock. Inside this bathroom, we find one of the only pre-war skeletons in this area. A woman in a teal dress lying on the ground. Above her is a first aid kit, and that's about it. With the top explored, we can hop off the roof and go down that stairway that we found leading down from the first floor that we entered. Here we find an open office plan with desks back to back. Against the eastern wall we find a door, and inside we find some laser tripwires attached to a Tesla trap. We also find a mesh glitch. The ceiling above us is transparent. We can see a dirt and debris decal lying on the floor above us. We can see up, but if we were to stand up there we could not see down. The laser tripwires were covering a hole that leads down to the next floor. But we can go out of this room and go into the one right next to it to jump down an even larger hole leading to the floor below. This room is empty, but going through the door, we can kill even more sleeping ghouls. This room must have been locked tight for centuries because we can see the distortions from a flammable gas. All that's left to explore is the elevator on this floor. Activating the door doesn't open the door to the elevator car. You have to push the button to open that door too. Inside, we can open the hatch in the roof to hop up on top of the elevator. From here, if we have a jetpack, we can then open the doors to each of the floors. But going back to the elevator to ride it up, it only connects to the top floor, going past all of the others. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the full story of the Atlantic offices. But wait, didn't Oxhorn say that there was a secret? Is Oxhorn like one of those lame YouTubers luring in people with some sort of clickbait only to disappoint them? Well, never fear, ladies and gentlemen, there is much more to the story of the Atlantic offices. It seems like Bethesda had greater plans for this particular corporate office building than they actually implemented in the game. We know this because there's a secret hidden room in the game files that you can only access using console commands, and this room is called the Atlantic offices. Just to be clear, I'm not using a mod to access this room. This room is in every version of the game for all devices, PCs, PlayStation, and Xbox One. It's just hidden. There's no way to access it without using console commands. But using console commands, we can zap into the unused cell called Atlantic Offices. Here we find ourselves at the top of a stairway. Looking down the stairway, we can dispatch one raider. The roof has crumbled into the stairways above us, preventing us from climbing upward. Instead, we can go through the southern door, which leads to more interior offices. Rounding the corner, we hear the sound of raiders. This leads us into another room, and we hear raiders above us.
Where'd the little bitch go?
I think we're good.
The door at the northern end of the wall has an exit sign above it. We can activate it, but it doesn't lead anywhere. This door likely connected to some sort of outside terrace or balcony, but since they cut it from the game, it's non-functional. Around the corner against the western wall, we find a broken elevator. Dangling on top of the car is a pre-war skeleton. Can you imagine the day the bombs drop, the ground becomes unstable beneath them, the building they are in begins to sink, and this poor desperate soul, unable to use the elevator, maybe jump down from an above floor to ride the car only to drop to his death. This room must have been under construction when the bombs dropped. We find some scaffolding leading up to a platform, which must have led to more offices. This is where the raiders were hanging out, but we really don't find much else. The elevator car is blocking us, so we can't enter the elevator, which means that we must go back the way we came and go down the stairs. This leads us to a large, rather empty room. We find one dirty mattress on the ground and a couple of sleeping bags. Looks like raiders were using this as a bedroom. And then we find a cymbal-clacking monkey trap. However, it's not connected to anything. Maybe Bethesda hadn't had a chance to wire this up to an actual trap yet. There's a balcony above us. Using the jetpack to jump on up, we find that every door is busted. There's nothing to explore up here. But in the corner of the room, we find that the floor has collapsed, making a ramp leading us down to the next floor. Here we find more raiders. Down the ramp and around the corner leads us to a balcony overlooking another room below. Going left through the doorway, we find a broken floor to the left with a hole that leads up to the floor above. And then going around the corner, we find a dressed mannequin beneath an extremely low-hanging ceiling light. I am crouched down in this shot, and my head still hits the ceiling light. Standing up, I walk right into it. They also used black trim on this light instead of the yellow trim that we're used to in workshop mode. We only see that in the Institute. This room is bare, so going through the door down the stairway, we find a grenade bouquet hanging from the ceiling. We can disarm it and then go down to disarm the tripwire. This tells us that the original point of entry was probably down on this floor instead of at the top of the skyscraper. This looks like some sort of lobby entrance. The raiders have placed a wooden barricade right in front of the elevator, which is our only path forward. The elevator brings us down to a lobby, and this is really messed up. Clearly, Bethesda abandoned the idea of using this interior cell in the game long before they got around to finishing it. We find floating dirt decals, and there's no roof at all. We can peer outside the cell. The interesting thing is that looking out the windows, we see downtown Boston, not the glowing sea. You can try to open these arched lobby doors, but they don't lead anywhere. But it looks as if they would have led outside to the streets of downtown Boston. The only other thing of note in this lobby is a waiting room, which has a first aid kit and a bunch of ammo boxes and a wooden crate. Here we find another door, and we can peer outside to downtown Boston. Now I got curious. I wanted to know exactly where this building would have been located in downtown Boston had they put it in the game. So I toggled the free cam and floated around outside. I managed to see the Boston airport off in the distance next to the water. There are a few major landmarks around here that help us orient ourselves. There's a tall, gray, formal-looking skyscraper right next to the Atlantic offices, and we're right by the water. With this information, I traveled to downtown Boston to see if I could pinpoint the original intended location for the Atlantic offices. At length, I found a greenish sort of building that had the look and feel of the interior cell that we just explored. It uses the same metal tiles and has many of the same windows. I toggled the free cam to float on up to approximately the position I was at when exploring the interior cell and looked out to sea. Sure enough, I saw the Boston airport in pretty much the same position as it was near the interior cell, and there's that same gray, formal-looking building right next to this one. This greenish-looking building must have been the original location for the Atlantic offices before it was cut. Sure enough, back on the ground, I find a door that I can actually interact with, but it doesn't lead anywhere. It looks just like the arched doors that we found on the inside of the interior cell. Going around the corner, we find a lot of raider platforms and scaffolding. This is where raiders were hanging out, just like the raiders we found in the Atlantic offices. And going around even more, we find a second door, just like the two arched doors that we found inside the Atlantic offices. But you can't enter this building. The only thing of interest is a window washer elevator attached to the outside of the building. Hitting the button brings us to the top of this wrecked structure. Explore the roof, and sure enough, we find a camp of raiders chilling out on top of the roof. The floors to this building have collapsed, and we can use them as ramps to climb down into some of the ruined rooms of this structure, where we find decorations typical of a corporate office: desks, filing cabinets, and even one advanced lock safe. So I think it's clear that this building was the original Atlantic offices in the game. It's in the right location, directly next to the gray formal-looking building, with the Boston airport off in the distance in the same location right next to the shore. It uses the same architectural elements as the Atlantic offices. It's infested with raiders, just like the Atlantic offices, and it has a ground floor lobby with the same two arched doors, one of which sort of works just like the Atlantic offices. I'm not sure why Bethesda cut the interior cell of this building from the game. Perhaps they just ran out of time and they didn't get a chance to finish it. They had this Atlantic offices sign already made, but after deciding not to use it, they simply stuck it on the side of that ruined building in the glowing sea so that it didn't go to waste. That's my best bet. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is the full story of the Atlantic offices in the glowing sea, the deleted interior cell from the game, and where I think the original location was in downtown Boston. Do you agree, or do you think that the location was likely somewhere else? Let me know in the comments section below. I read all of your comments and I use them as inspiration for my future videos. I publish a new video every single day of the week, so if you like this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe. And if you'd like to chat about this topic with other like-minded individuals on our Oxhorn community Discord server, check out the invitation link that I include in the description below. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Patreon subscribers get access to a private channel on my Discord server, as well as a bunch of other cool Oxhorn perks. But more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just so glad that you're here watching this video today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a brand new video.